The trauma can be what didn't happen. So when the trauma is emotional neglect, when the trauma is a lack of attunement, when the trauma is inconsistency in a relationship, the body
Yeah.
takes it as trauma. And you can talk yourself out of it being bad enough all you want. Your body is having a response to it.
Welcome to Wired and Worthy, the podcast for people who feel everything deeply, think about everything constantly, and have spent way too long believing that they were too much. I'm Dr. Amelia Kelly, your host, someone who believes the way you're wired was never the problem. You belong here exactly as you are. Because remember, you may be wired differently, but you are worthy always. Let's get into it. Yeah, I'm so excited because I received your book. Would you mind holding it up? Because love it.
Here we go.
Yep. So we're going to be talking about complex PTSD today. But something I love about our conversation that I'm expecting to love about our conversation is that we're definitely going to be looking at how complex PTSD can rewire our just life experience in general. And then you give so many amazing ways to deal with that in the work you do.
Yes.
Yeah. So can you tell us first, like, what even made you want to write about this? Why is this a passion for you? And I mean, who are you?
Okay. So I'll start with, it's all kind of intertwined, right? I am a therapist as my profession. I'm human beyond just being a therapist. So I have my own experience with complex PTSD, as many of us therapists kind of have our own experiences with what we tend to specialize in. But it took a really, really long time for me to, one, even have that named as what it was, but two, for me to even recognize this early on in my clinical work within my clients. I was trained at a very behaviorally oriented clinic when I was in my pre-licensure period.
Okay.
And people would start to kind of like make improvements in their symptoms, but we would almost always hit a plateau. And I started trying to do a little bit more research and more training into understanding why are people hitting these blocks. And I realized that a majority of my clients, especially my clients who were women and women with sexual trauma histories, attachment trauma histories, were navigating complex PTSD, which we know is not compatible with a purely kind of like cognitive behavioral approach. And that was the same in my own clinical work as a client myself. I started hitting those plateaus until I did my own more experiential work around my trauma. And that was what helped me kind of break free from it. So I realized that a lot of the ways in which we can recover from trauma are not always openly discussed or openly accessible. And in addition, women's experiences of complex trauma in the complex trauma literature aren't as frequently highlighted. A lot of people talk about how complex trauma starts in childhood, but for a lot of women, it can actually start in adolescence or later adulthood, especially when they've experienced some abusive adulthood relationships.
Yeah.
So there are different ways of approaching complex trauma based off of the onset of the trauma, and women's experiences aren't always the same as men's experiences. And women are also more likely to develop complex PTSD than men are. So I did want to, twice as likely.
Twice as likely.
Twice as likely.
So I definitely want to unpack that. So we're going to put like a pin. And I always say I put things on my shelf, like my mental shelf. I would love if you don't mind to back up just a little bit to the idea of plateauing though, because that's an interesting way of putting it. We can say like getting stuck, but when I think of plateau, I think of like someone who's making progress. You know, we think of like weight, for example. You say like you hit a plateau. How would someone who is in complex trauma recovery, which according to research on average, it's about 3 to 5 years in therapy minimum, to work towards kind of a more healed version or post-traumatic growth version of us. So what do you think? And that's just a number. That doesn't mean it's hard and fast for everyone. How would you define a plateau? Like, how did you know personally, actually, that you hit a plateau in your healing?
It was when I started doing everything right, but didn't feel different.
For
Right.
anyone not
Yeah.
watching, their quotes. Okay.
Air quotes.
Mm-hmm.
In the sense of, let's say, again, kind of pulling from just my like purely behavioral training, which absolutely has its use. I'm by no means knocking it, but
Right.
I would be doing the behavioral work. I was doing the cognitive restructuring work. And one of the most common things that I even hear in my clinical work is this: I know this logically, but I don't feel it.
Okay.
And that's something that I hear a lot of even other clinicians say. They'll find themselves getting stuck, or a lot of clients will say, I know this logically, but I don't feel it. And what we know about traumatized individuals is that the amygdala, where the fight or flight response lives, is hyperactive. It is going, going, going. And the prefrontal cortex, where logic lives, is underactive.
Right.
So it's very hard to embody a feeling of safety and a feeling of knowing when the part of the brain that is required to know isn't even online.
Yeah, sometimes people probably heard me I call it the workbench, the
Mm-hmm.
frontal cortex. Like, we've got all the information gathered here and we're like, what do we do with this? And it makes sense because when we are under threat, we don't need to be doing math computations. Like, we
Nope.
need to just be surviving. So of course the areas of the brain responsible for surviving get rewired to be stronger. Um,
Exactly.
so what I heard you say, it's an interesting way of putting it. For you, the plateau was when mentally you kind of had these ahas and the awareness, but physically, at least, and maybe it's not this simple, but physically the knowing mentally wasn't matching your physical experience. Is that what you were
Exactly.
saying? Okay. Hmm.
Anxiety was still sky high. The distress was still really high. The hypervigilance was through the roof. All of these
Yeah.
things that were representative of a stress response, despite the implementation of the coping behaviors, of the cognitive restructuring, of the like not doing what the anxiety wants me to do, right? Kind of opposite action type of interventions. And
Yeah.
still with all of the insight, right? I knew where it was coming from. I knew what was getting activated. I could trace it back to XYZ moment, but it wasn't enough because my body was still storing the emotional distress of past experiences that weren't processed yet.
Yeah.
So anything that essentially activated a fragment of those traumatic experiences, my body would just take it and run.
Okay. So let's say hypothetically someone has, and this kind of reminds me of, I saw a funny meme once where it was something like, okay, so I've spent all this money. I know why I'm so screwed up. Not to say that that's like the experience of someone having trauma, but I think before we keep unpacking and come back to our pin, how would you define the difference? Because what you're saying right now doesn't sound different from what just a kind of big T trauma, PTSD, someone who's maybe experienced like assault or a natural disaster or war, like these kind of like more obvious, I guess we could say
Yeah.
single incident traumas that can be so deeply rooted and traumatizing. How could someone listening who is just getting familiar with the idea of complex trauma, like, how do you know the difference? How do you know if you're struggling with one versus the other?
Yeah. So if we're going to break it down to the way that the DSM defines capital P PTSD, these type 1 traumas are traumas that are life threatening. In order to be diagnosed with PTSD, you need to meet the criterion A, which essentially says that you've been exposed to or have experienced a life threatening event.
Right.
With complex trauma, the event does not need to be life threatening. And in fact, most of the time it's not, but your body perceives it as a threat to your safety, even if it's not actually threatening your life. This can be things like bullying, emotional neglect, traumatic relationships, attachment trauma, all of these things that are repeated interpersonal wounds that don't necessarily, again, have this life threat attached to it. But your body is in a state of constant stress that can be likened to almost a emotional death by 1,000 cuts rather than this single incident event that results in this type 1 PTSD.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up neglect because that's something that I'm sure you've probably heard in your office before. Well, at least they didn't hit me, or at least they didn't, lay a hand on me. And We know that neglect, for example, or even stonewalling as like the Gottman
Mm-hmm.
theory, or like the silent treatment, actually is such a threat to our system that it can drop our immune system's ability to function.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The trauma can be what didn't happen.
Hmm. Well, how did you experience that? The trauma being what didn't happen?
The trauma being what didn't happen is that if you think back to what people need, people have emotional needs. We are creatures of connection. The research on what happens to us when we're not in connection is so thorough, and exactly what you're saying. It literally depletes our immune functioning. So when the trauma is emotional neglect, when the trauma is a lack of attunement, when the trauma is inconsistency in a relationship, that the lack of the relationship, the lack of that attunement, the lack of the consistency is traumatic. The body
Yeah.
takes it as trauma. And you can talk yourself out of it being bad enough all you want. Your body is having a response to it.
So, how does it then, when you come to these, you call them plateaus,
Mm-hmm.
how can someone listening who has been neglected, mistreated, misunderstood, maybe they've walked on eggshells, maybe they've hadn't had the opportunity as a child to have their own sense of ego, their own sense of individuality, and they're sitting here listening, going, okay, yes, that's me. And I'm walking around feeling keyed up all the time in my relationships, or walking around feeling misunderstood, or like someone's out to get me. These are really common thinking patterns after complex trauma. What would be some of your, and I don't want you to give away all your secrets, but I hope you impart some of them.
Yeah.
Um, what would be, maybe some of the easiest first steps to stepping to the edge and getting through and over the plateau?
The very, very, very first step is, well, when we're talking about the plateau, the assumption is that some people already have some awareness of this. So that is step one. You're already ahead of the game. So many people don't even develop that awareness. So amazing. Once you have awareness of this plateau and essentially all of the experiences that have resulted in the distress that you're experiencing today, and things in your day to day feel stable enough. That's
Yeah.
key. We want to make sure that things in your life feel stable enough, because
Why
opening
is
up
that
wounds,
important?
when life is not feeling stable can be incredibly destabilizing. And if you're already feeling a little bit destabilized, you don't want to tack on
So
to
can I
that.
pause you on that? I agree with you. Like, for example, I won't start an EMDR treatment or brain spotting treatment with someone when they're actively in the abuse, or when they're abusing substances, or when their nervous system is
Yeah.
not primed for healing safely and in a contained way. However, I don't really know many people who have experienced complex trauma who are not currently in a stressful relationship.
So if the relationship is actively threatening, then you are actively in your trauma. And so, for that reason, we are essentially opening up past trauma while you're still in an environment where you are being re traumatized. And that can be a contraindication. For people who are in stressful relationships, is the stress coming from the external? Is it essentially life threatening? Is the trauma coming from the external relationship, or is it also coming from the internal activation of your past trauma? Those are different things that we want to make sure that we clarify, right? Because people are coming to trauma therapy because they're experiencing a lot of stress, because they're experiencing a lot of pain. So we're not expecting things to be perfectly stable. And that's why I
Right.
intentionally use the terminology, we want things to be stable enough. We want to make sure that you are able to
Okay.
tolerate holding distress. There is no effective work when you are outside your window of tolerance.
How does someone know if they can tolerate stress enough?
We use the window of tolerance for that. So it's essentially a window. I have a little demo with my hands for people who are watching this. And if you have complex trauma, your window is going to be a little bit more narrow inherently. So phase one of trauma work is again stabilization, which can help with making your window a little bit bigger, just enough so that you can hold distressing material, which is required for any type of trauma work, and you don't find yourself hyper aroused, which is essentially activating panic, or hypo aroused, which will then activate your freeze response, your shutdown dissociative response. We want to make sure that you can hold a little bit of discomfort without finding yourself overwhelmed or shut down. Again, it does not need to be that you are perfect all the time and don't experience some activation. Like, we want that activation, but just not too much.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm trying to envision if someone's listening and they're thinking, okay, so window, tolerance, therapist in front of me helping me identify it. That's a lot more feasible. But if they're sitting and listening, like, okay, how do I know? For you, I guess personally, like, how would you be able to tell if you're in or out of your window? Because maybe that would give people kind of a better example. Or maybe, I don't know if you offer in your book, do you have like an exercise to help people
I actually
figure that
do
out?
have an exercise.
So essentially, it's almost like I handed that off perfectly.
Perfect. So you do want to first assess what starts to feel like too much. And you might even want to reflect back to a time where it did start to feel like too much, right? You don't need to bring it up. You don't need to activate yourself and be too much right now to reflect back on a time where you did have this level of distress. What was your body communicating to you? What thoughts were going through your brain? Were there any urges? What did it feel like emotionally, somatically, cognitively? And jot that down. It is a spectrum from this too little to too much to just right. So think about a time where it felt like too much. What was that experience like? And think about a time where it was too little. What was that experience like?
Meaning like you weren't even at all engaged in trauma work, you weren't even thinking about it, or you were shut down?
When I say too little, you're shut down. The overwhelm feels so intense that you shut down. Think about a time where maybe you are let's say you're carrying a glass of water to your couch, and then you drop it and the glass shatters everywhere, and you find yourself just frozen staring at the shattered glass of water before you can mobilize or do anything about it. That's an example of a time where you shut down. The overwhelm felt almost kind of like too much that you literally froze.
I'm laughing when I think about last week. I was trying to move things around in here and I knocked over this lamp, which I just finally bought a new one today. Like, it took me a whole week of over processing. And I remember when it fell and I just stared. Like, I did exactly what you're saying. I didn't move. It was almost like I looked around to be like, did anyone else notice that? Even though I'm in the room by myself.
Exactly. So in that moment when you froze, what was that experience like for you? What did it feel like emotionally, somatically, anything cognitive coming up for you?
This is interesting though, because I had an experience recently, and I don't even need to go into like the why behind it, where I do think I experienced like a kind of like a trauma shutdown in relation to something. And for me, my shutdown felt different than my freeze. So my freeze, my freeze felt like like what you just described, kind of like the broken glass. But my shutdown, which I like even less, which feels even worse, feels like I am so tired that I need the longest nap ever, but there's no reason for me to be tired. Like, it's just like this, like you just woke up, but not in like a refreshing way.
So you bring up a really important point, and freeze and shutdown are two different things. So freeze, you are externally frozen, but your sympathetic response is activated. Your heart is racing. You physiologically are activated, but on the outside, you're frozen. Yes. Whereas when you are shut down, your heart rate slows down, parasympathetic response is overactive.
Yes.
So
I don't like that feeling.
A different. Yeah.
That to me is so uncomfortable. It almost feels like a short-term depression.
Exactly. That's what a lot of people liken it to. Or a lot of people will say, I'm on autopilot, like I'm going through the motions, but I feel nothing.
Yeah, which is terrible. So do you have anything that people can do when they're in shutdown?
When you're in shutdown, because it's an overactivation of your parasympathetic nervous system, you do need to start gently activating your sympathetic nervous system, which means bringing movement and activation back into the body. So that can look like start with just the smallest thing accessible to you. That might be like rocking back and forth can start bringing some movement back into the body. Going for a walk. Sometimes people really kind of want to like sky rocket it and they'll do jumping jacks, and that's great. Other things that you can do are having like a sour candy or something can also activate a little bit. I really like the exercise of physically pushing your arms up against the wall can start to bring a little bit more strength back into your limbs, which can help with moving you out of this shutdown response. These are things that can help with changing your state, which is a little bit more temporary, but for that longer term trait change, that's where more of that depth oriented work comes in.
Yeah, I'm thinking of in my office, I have a little sensory basket where I have ice packs, mini Tic Tacs, and like little menthol smellers.
Yeah.
And some like essential oils for people if they really need them. Admittedly, I dip into the Tic Tacs sometimes, you guys. Love the orange ones. But I wonder your opinion on if that's common, because we're talking about, like you said, changing your state very purposely, not necessarily with something that's dopagenic, I guess you would say, not like fast dopamine, but I feel like, or I wonder what your thoughts are on people who use things like scrolling or food or substances because they're trying to constantly pull themselves out of that shutdown state.
Yeah. And sometimes I view that as more people falling into the shutdown state than pulling themselves out of the shutdown state, because the shutdown state in and of itself is also protective. It's protective from chronic stress and pain, right? And so mindless scrolling can feel like it's numbing.
So the movement you said is really, really helpful for if someone's experiencing shutdown. I'm trying to imagine that time where I felt very shut down. I think I remember, it's funny, I remember putting like just flipping my TV on. I didn't really watch anything, but I had like Bob Ross in the background or something. It wasn't even on purpose. And something about watching him move, even I felt something enlivening.
Yep.
So is that
mirror neurons?
Oh, right. Okay. And because I'm highly sensitive, it's probably even more effective.
Yeah.
Huh. Okay. And I guess that makes sense when I think about people who feel very shut down in that complex trauma state, and they will watch a comedy, or actually, this makes me wonder even about folks who will do something so opposite. They'll watch something like Law and Order SVU.
Yeah. Some people, if that helps like activate again your sympathetic nervous system, can help with mobilizing you. For some other people, it can exacerbate exposure to trauma. So what works for one person might not work for another. And trial and error here.
Yes. Okay, so we've talked about getting out of the shutdown state. Do you think people with complex trauma more so fall into that state, or do you see any propensity towards fight flight? And what are your recommendations for complex trauma when they fall into those states?
Yeah, so there actually isn't any specific literature on people with complex trauma and who falls more into what defensive response than others, except that women are more likely to fawn than men.
Okay.
Which kind of makes sense if you think about it.
Right.
Women are more likely to appease in order to try to stay safe, whereas men are also more likely to fight. But beyond that, there isn't necessarily anything that clarifies that this person is going to fawn, or this person's going to shut down, or this person's going to get activated. And to your initial point, I got kind of sidetracked.
No worries. We are all about being totally wired crazy. So that's fine. And I feel like sometimes do you ever find when you're talking about stuff like this, because we are technically talking about things that are very destabilizing, sometimes it can actually destabilize your train of thought while you're talking about it.
For me, it's more that I'm so passionate about this and my mind goes into so many different things. I'm like, fun fact this and fun fact
I love
that. And I'm
that.
like, oh, I forgot my point.
You're in the right place then. So with the fawn thing, you were saying with women though, one thing I thought was really interesting, like when we're talking about the different states of complex trauma, I didn't really think about or realize that fawning is a sympathetic state.
Mm-hmm.
Like fawning, it's an action.
Yes. Fawning is essentially an activation of your social engagement system and your fight or flight and your sympathetic response.
Together.
Yeah. At the same time.
Can you give us an example of why that is? Because for people who are not as nerdy about like trauma states as we are, they might be thinking, okay, what in the world are you talking about?
Yeah. So we have a social engagement system, which is essentially a like grounded, connected state when we are in relation with others that feels safe. And so this is the concept of co-regulation. When you are in a safe relationship with someone else, whether that is a partner or a friend or a therapist, you feel this grounded connectedness. That's the bottom level, right? We're grounded here. Then we have our fight or flight response right above it. And that is activation of the amygdala, right? We see a threat and we either fight or we flee. And it's essentially just kind of like stress hormones activate. Something's not fully safe here and I need to respond. Fawning is the activation of the social engagement system and your sympathetic activation, your fight or flight response, because something's not safe in your environment. And you need to use your social connection to essentially try to get yourself out of that threatening situation. You need to appease or please or use your ability to connect as a way to almost, like I say this in air quotes, disarm, whether that's emotionally or actually, the person who you are perceiving as the threat.
Right. Like walking on eggshells.
Like walking on eggshells.
Mm-hmm. So what is your suggestion for someone who tends to fawn?
If you tend to fawn, one, the biggest thing that I have people assess for starters is the person across from you actually safe and you're having a fawn response, or are they not safe and you're having an appropriate response?
Okay, we need to sit on that for a second because I feel like that's so common with complex trauma because a post-traumatic growth benefit is that you are more sensitive to emotional vampires and that you can notice those things. But then I feel like, and especially women, tend to then doubt if they're right or not.
Yes. And trauma therapy is not going to result, like we're not in the business of having you gaslight yourself into thinking a situation is safe when it's actually not, or that a person is safe when they're actually not. So if you're across from an emotional vampire, and let's say it's your boss and you don't have the privilege of just quitting your job and you do have to fawn, is this actually a protective mechanism that's kicking in when you need it? So a lot of what I talk about with people is that when we work through trauma, we're essentially making sure that these responses don't get activated when they don't need to be activated. So step one is the fawn response fitting the facts here. If yes, do what you got to do to keep yourself safe.
Okay.
If not, this is where some people might kind of hit their plateau here. If you are able to acknowledge that this is a safe relationship and that I'm finding myself fawning, it's almost kind of like that gentle, gradual practice of let me first reconnect with myself and what I value and what I need. And let me bring that into this relationship gradually so that I can learn that other people are safe. And I can start to really embody this feeling that I can prioritize myself and that there won't be a repercussion. If that feels really, really hard and you know all of this stuff logically, but when it comes to facing this person, you freeze because, again, prefrontal cortex is off, that's where it's really important to go back and to help yourself process the experiences that have resulted in you learning that relationships aren't safe in the first place and that you need to fawn in order to survive.
Now, how do you do that in real time? because you're
So
not exactly going to say, okay, hold on one second. I need to get my
no, so
journal out.
you don't do it in
Oh,
real time.
okay.
You
Okay.
do it gradually, right? The
Mm-hmm.
more you
Mm-hmm.
process this stuff, the more your amygdala activation goes down, more prefrontal activation goes up, and the more you have access to it, the more you have access to those skills. So you can do that on your own through journaling, through writing about the experiences that you've had, through therapeutic work, through EMDR, IFS, somatic therapy, those types of more experiential interventions. And then once you release the emotional experience that you're carrying from your past, again, amygdala activation theoretically goes down, gives you more access to it in the moment, in the future.
So I wonder your opinion on overprocessing, because I feel like sometimes that can be, I love the look on your face
I'm like,
when I
tell me
said,
more. What do you mean
um,
overprocessing?
well, because when we look at sometimes what happens when, if you ever look at like the science of the difference between like processing and complaining, I hate the word
Yes.
complaining, but um, where different parts of the brain fire different, we have different somatic responses. Like we can actually have inflammation when we're complaining, whereas we can have a reduction in inflammatory properties when we're processing. And it's hard for us to sit down and order up what we're doing, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So how do we, and maybe it's a sense of like peace within the body or radical acceptance. I don't know what it would be. I'm wondering your opinion. Like, how do we know that we are processing enough where it's helping to reduce that activation in the amygdala, but we're not over processing to the point where we're perseverating, fixating, catastrophizing?
Yeah.
Like, it just seems like such a fine line.
Yes. And this is kind of coming in from my EMDR background, but are you looping? Is it moving or are you looping? Is it kind of like the same thing over and over again? Is your distress about this going down or is it staying the same? If
I
it's
like
staying the
that.
same, you're probably perseverating, you're probably ruminating. It might lean maybe a little bit more into complaining versus if it is moving, if you're finding yourself having insights about different things or again the distress is going down, it's you're good. Just keep doing what you got to do.
I am so like impressed with how simple your answer was. Like in the best way. I love when there's a good simple answer to something because I mean, I could see that being really true, and it makes me think of, gosh, I'm going to steal that. I'm going to steal that and use it in therapy because I could see how like some of my clients who they maybe have more OCD tendencies and they
Yeah.
sometimes struggle with like what's the difference between me processing versus me checking
Yeah.
and and constantly, you know, assessing whether or not I'm morally falling off my ladder. So I guess to your point, it can be as simple as, is this moving, and is there kind of like a finish line to this thought process versus am I just on a hamster wheel like running in place?
Exactly. And if you are perseverating, the distress about the event that you're processing isn't necessarily going down either. In fact, it might be going up.
That makes sense. And I mean, it kind of makes sense too when you think about why our brains get so rewired after trauma, because we have to double check constantly to make sure that,
Mm-hmm.
well, we perceive that we can prevent the situation from happening again. So we double, triple, quadruple, and those like neural connections get so deep, so deep.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, I feel like we've like really well laid out if you're, you know, rewired in any of these different flight responses from complex trauma, like what can you do? Let's say we're talking to someone who feels like they're kind of beyond the plateau. They're in the space of healing. They're moving towards, you know, a lot more safety. But then life throws something in. Like I had a client that we were making tons of progress on their complex trauma, and then they witnessed their spouse getting hit by a car in front of them.
Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh.
Yes. And I will say it probably took a full year from that incident to now, where I feel like we're finally coming back to where we even were before that situation happened. So because life keeps happening, what could you say to people who have overcome the plateau? They've done some of the things that you've talked about, like physical movement, expression, journaling, therapy, EMDR, all the things, and then a trauma, life happens.
Yeah. It's that progress is not linear. And I know that's very cliche, but it's the truth. And life does happen. And some traumas will, unfortunately, hopefully not, but can continue to be experienced. And for someone who witnesses their spouse getting hit by a car, that's an incredibly traumatic
Whether or
situation.
not you came with trauma already.
Whether
Yes.
or not you came with trauma already.
It just felt so
So,
unfair. Like I remember
and
as their therapist, just how unfair that felt.
yes, absolutely. And so that is experiencing something like that is not an erasure of the progress that someone has made. And if you've cleared so much stuff and you've done the work and you've made tremendous amounts of progress, that also can prop up your ability to handle future stressors when they do come up. I always say that wellness is not the absence of stressors, it's your ability to cope with them when they come up. And that's an objectively traumatic situation that meets that
Absolutely.
capital PTSD criteria, right? Not even the complex one.
Right.
So also part of recovery and healing is being able to validate yourself when you go through some pretty traumatic stuff, because a lot of complex trauma survivors are invalidating themselves and gaslighting themselves into thinking that they should feel differently or be differently or insert all of these different shoulds, when in reality your response is adaptive and makes sense given what you've experienced.
Yeah, I would say for me, when I feel like someone has kind of crested over that plateau, it's when without my help, I hear them validating themselves and I hear them like recognizing the response. Recently talking with a client where they were having very natural responses to something, but then they were having like a metacognition about the response. And I was saying that you're not getting hung up on the initial thought. The initial thought, we all have, we all have catastrophe thoughts. We all have negative thoughts. We all have bad moods, but it's like the thought about the thought. Can we catch our beliefs that happen there?
Yeah.
I feel like that's so crucial. So I'm curious, if you were to think about all the things in your beautiful book that you are giving, and I love it. It's like a toolbox. I mean, it's literally like, here you go. Here's all these fantastic things that people get to do when they're in your room or with you. What would you say is maybe one or two things that are maybe we don't even want to say your favorite, because guys, go get the book, but that, I don't know, you just find to be really helpful for long-term healing?
Yes. I'll give two, but it's so hard, but I'll give two.
It's a Christmas gift.
The first one is parts mapping, which is one of my favorite things to do with complex trauma work. We have developed so many protective parts. We've learned to exile different parts of ourselves. We react in ways that are protective, even if they might harm us. And we move through the world in ways that also feel protective, even if in the long run it might harm us. So identifying, how am I moving through the world and how did I learn to protect myself in these ways, and what parts of myself have I rejected? Did I learn weren't good enough or should be cast away, or that I feel ashamed of? It's essentially building awareness into who am I and who am I actually when I'm not being led in these protective ways. So when you get to change your relationship to the different parts of yourself is when you get to be led from a place of greater authenticity. And people with complex trauma often feel like they don't have that solidified sense of self. So when you really build that insight, you also get to reconnect with your sense of self. So that's one of the biggest ones. Another one that I find really important is self-forgiveness. When we have behaved or moved through the world in a way that is protective, we may hold a lot of shame around that. We may look back at things and say, I can't believe that I did that. I can't believe I was this type of person. I guess, even though it was coming from a place of protecting yourself due to the experiences that you've had. I'm a firm believer that you never need to forgive the perpetrators of your trauma if that is not something that's aligned for you. But you do need to forgive yourself for the way that you coped with your trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of healing your relationship with yourself.
Yeah. I'm so intrigued by that because I am going to be having Mark Walwyn, who wrote It Didn't Start With You, on the podcast. I don't know if you've read his book.
I have not, but I have it on my bookshelf.
Yeah, he is a strong believer in the opposite, that like we have to also be doing the forgiveness of everyone else. And so I'm not in any particular camp. I think it's very individualized, and I just find it so intriguing, like what really serves each of us so individually the best. And I think forgiveness in general has such a healing property that whether it be for you and like what you could or could not do in that state of freeze or in that state of trauma, and or letting go of something that someone had done to you, whatever act it is, wherever the forgiveness comes from or moves through, I see healing potential. So I'm really intrigued maybe I'll have to stack you guys. Maybe I'll have to have like your episode and then his episode come out and like hear these contrasts.
Yeah. And I want to highlight that I view it from an individualized place as well, but there are a lot of people who feel as though forgiveness is almost kind of like, it's just not accessible for them. And forgiving is not necessary to heal or recover from your trauma or to live a fulfilling life. And for some people, they're like, I do need to forgive in order to move forward with my life. And that is totally fine too. So either camp is okay, individualized process, as long as you are forgiving yourself.
Yeah. Do you feel like, I promised that was my last question, but now I have one more. Do you feel like that was something you had to do? And I mean, is that what helped you over your plateau?
It was not what helped me over my plateau. And in my case, and for many people's case, it can be challenging because for a lot of people, especially when the trauma comes from a family system, the trauma can be ongoing. And so do you forgive a trauma or maybe a perpetrator of trauma who is still doing what they are doing? And that's an individual process and an individual choice.
Really hard.
But I will say it was not necessary for me to overcome my plateau.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And that's just, I think, a nice permission slip for anyone listening, that it is so individualized. So, gosh, Debbie, I just am so grateful for this conversation because I feel like there are so many different ways you can have these conversations about trauma, but the way that you see it and were able to explain it, I could absolutely see someone who maybe up to this point has been walking around thinking, gosh, I just wish I felt different. I just wish I saw like my past differently. I just wish I was different. That's something I see a lot when someone's endured trauma. Just, I wish it hadn't happened. I wish I wasn't feeling the way I'm feeling. Like, I wish I wasn't wired this way, to kind of, but really at the core of it, like, it's not a sign of brokenness. It is a sign of reaction to a situation. And you laid out these amazingly beautiful ways that people can support themselves. So I'm really grateful for that. So for anyone listening who wants to find out more about your book, your work, and maybe they're in the state and can work with you. I know there's a lot of things with we can't cross state lines as far as therapy goes, but where could they find you and continue to get support from you?
So you can buy my book, Self-Directed Complex PTSD Exercises for Women, at Barnes & Noble, Amazon, Target, Walmart. I think it's all over. You can find me on Instagram and TikTok at Therapy Debbie. And if you are in New York and are looking for therapy, you can find my practice at manhattanpsychotherapy.co.
Awesome. Okay. It was nice to meet you. I would love to stay connected. Maybe we should have Zeitgeist have an author party. Have a party, get us all together. We could do like a live episode. But thank you everyone for listening. And hopefully there was, something that you learned today that either maybe you've heard before and you now have a new way of applying it directly to your life, and just understanding that each and every one of us carries a different type of reaction to our past, and that your past doesn't have to define how you're feeling every moment of today. So you may be wired differently, but you are worthy always. Thank you for being with us.